The American Civil War Prologue. A nation divided by the middle of the 19th century. The United States looked like one republic on a map. It stretched from the Atlantic coast toward the vast western frontier, growing richer, larger, and more powerful with each passing decade. But beneath that image of unity, the country was splitting into two different worlds. In the North, industry was transforming society. Cities expanded. Immigrants arrived by the thousands. Railroads crossed the landscape. Factories produced iron, textiles, weapons, machines, and tools. Telegraph wires carried messages faster than any generation before had imagined. The North was restless, urban, commercial, and increasingly tied to wage labor and industrial capitalism. In the South, a different system ruled. Its wealth came from land, cotton, tobacco, and plantations. It was a society built on hierarchy, tradition, and the power of planters who saw themselves as guardians of an older order. But beneath the image of honor and gentility lay the brutal truth that sustained the entire Southern economy. Slavery. 4 million enslaved black men, women, and children lived under a system of forced labor and violence. Families were separated on auction blocks. Human beings were bought, sold, punished, hunted, and controlled as property. The cotton economy brought enormous wealth, but it depended on the denial of freedom to millions. Slavery was not a side issue. It was the central wound in the American Republic. For decades, politicians tried to contain the crisis through compromise. The Missouri Compromise drew lines across maps. The Compromise of 1850 tried to calm disputes over new territories. But every westward expansion raised the same question. Would new lands be free, or would slavery expand into them? To many Southerners, any limit on slavery's expansion was an attack on their rights, their property, and their future. To a growing number of Northerners, slavery was a moral evil that corrupted the Republic and threatened free labor. The arguments became violent. In Kansas, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought in a conflict so bloody it became known as Bleeding Kansas. In the United States Senate, Representative Preston Brooks beat Senator Charles Sumner with a cane after Sumner delivered an anti-slavery speech. The violence that had once been contained in words was now breaking into open life. The American House was divided, and soon it would fall into war. Chapter 1. Lincoln and Secession. The compromises of earlier decades had delayed the crisis, but they had not solved it. The Fugitive Slave Act forced Northern citizens and officials to assist in returning escaped enslaved people to bondage, making slavery visible in places that had once imagined themselves distant from it. The Dred Scott decision deepened the wound by declaring that black people could not claim citizenship and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery from the territories. For many Northerners, these events suggested that slavery was not merely defending itself. It was expanding its power. For the South, every Northern protest felt like proof of hostility. Southern leaders warned that if slavery could be restricted in the territories, slaveholding states would eventually become a permanent minority. They believed their political security, economic system, and social order were all at stake. This is why the election of 1860 became more than a normal contest for office. It became a referendum on the future of slavery and the future of the Union itself. Into this crisis stepped Abraham Lincoln, a tall, self-taught lawyer from Illinois. He was not a radical abolitionist when he rose to national prominence. He did not claim that the federal government could abolish slavery in states where it already existed. But he was firmly opposed to the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Lincoln understood the deeper meaning of that position. If slavery could not expand, it would eventually weaken. If it could expand, it might dominate the future of the nation. In 1860, Lincoln ran for president as the candidate of the Republican Party. His name did not even appear on the ballot in many southern states. But the North had more people, and the Democratic Party was divided. Lincoln won the election without carrying a single southern state. To many Southerners, his victory meant that their political power was broken. A president elected entirely by Northern votes, committed to stopping slavery's expansion, seemed to them like a direct threat to their future. Before Lincoln even took office, South Carolina acted. In December 1860, a convention in South Carolina voted to secede from the Union. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas soon followed. Federal forts, arsenals, and offices were seized. A new government was formed, the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi planter and former U.S. Senator, became its president. The Confederacy claimed it was defending states' rights. But the right at the center of the conflict was the right to own enslaved people. Its leaders made clear that slavery was fundamental to their new nation. Lincoln traveled to Washington under threat of assassination. In March 1861, standing before the unfinished dome of the Capitol, he delivered his first inaugural address. He told the South he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. But he also declared that the Union was perpetual. Secession, in his view, was not legal. It was rebellion. He pleaded for peace, speaking of the better angels of American nature. But the crisis had already narrowed to one place: Fort Sumter. Chapter 2. Fort Sumter sat in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. It was a federal fort, held by a small U.S. Army garrison under Major Robert Anderson. Around it stood Confederate batteries, armed and ready. Anderson's men were running out of food. Lincoln faced a dangerous choice. If he abandoned the fort, he would appear to accept secession. If he reinforced it with troops, the Confederacy would call it aggression. Lincoln chose a careful middle path. He sent unarmed supply ships carrying food, not soldiers. That placed the decision in Confederate hands. Jefferson Davis and his cabinet decided they could not allow a federal fort to remain in a Confederate harbor. General P. G.T. Beauregard demanded Anderson surrender. Anderson refused. At 4:30 inches the morning on April 12, 1861, a Confederate mortar shell rose over Charleston Harbor and exploded above Fort Sumter. The war had begun. For 34 hours, Confederate guns fired on the fort. Shells struck brick walls. Fire spread inside. Smoke filled the air. Anderson's men fought back, but they were surrounded and low on supplies. At last, Anderson lowered the American flag and surrendered. No one was killed during the bombardment, but the nation had crossed the point of no return. Fort Sumter also revealed Lincoln's political skill. By sending food rather than soldiers, he made clear that he was not seeking to invade the South. If shots were fired, the Confederacy would fire first. In the North, that mattered. Many people who had been uncertain about coercion now saw the attack as an assault on the national flag. In the South, the bombardment became a symbol of independence. Crowds in Charleston watched the shells arc through the sky, as if witnessing the birth of a new nation. They cheered the guns, believing they had forced the old Union to recognize their resolve. Both sides read the same event as proof of their own righteousness. That was one of the tragedies of the Civil War. Each side believed history, honor, and survival were on its side. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. In response, 4 more states seceded: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. The Confederacy moved its capital to Richmond, Virginia, placing it dangerously close to Washington, D.C., across North and South. Young men rushed to enlist. They marched through streets to cheering crowds and brass bands. Many believed the war would be short. Many believed one great battle would settle everything. That illusion died at Bull Run. Chapter 3. Bull Run, July 1861. A Union army marched from Washington toward Manassas, Virginia, where Confederate forces waited near a stream called Bull Run. The plan was simple: defeat the Confederate army, open the road to Richmond, and end the rebellion quickly. So confident were people in Washington that civilians rode out in carriages to watch the battle. Politicians, reporters, and families brought picnic baskets, expecting a patriotic spectacle. They were about to witness war. The armies that met at Bull Run were large but inexperienced. Many soldiers had never heard a bullet fired in anger. Uniforms were not standardized. Smoke from black powder muskets filled the fields and woods, making command nearly impossible. Units became confused. Men fired at shadows. Some shot at their own side. For a time, the Union Army seemed to be winning. Confederate lines bent under pressure. Then, on Henry House Hill, a brigade of Virginians held firm under General Thomas Jackson. As men rallied around him, Jackson earned the name that would follow him into legend: Stonewall. Confederate reinforcements arrived by rail. Their counterattack struck the exhausted Union forces. The strange, piercing cry of Confederate soldiers, later known as the Rebel Yell, rose across the battlefield. The Union line broke. A retreat became a rout. Soldiers threw down weapons and ran toward Washington. Civilian spectators panicked, turning the roads into chaos. Carriages, horses, soldiers, and wagons clogged the bridges and roads back to the capital. Bull Run was a Confederate victory, but its deeper message was for both sides. The war would not be quick. Nearly 5,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The blood on the fields of Virginia ended the innocent belief that courage and enthusiasm would be enough. Lincoln now understood that he faced not a small rebellion, but a vast and determined war. The North would need armies, money, industry, discipline, and time. The South would need endurance, unity, and victories strong enough to break Northern will. The war was only beginning. Bull Run also exposed the weakness of leadership on both sides. Officers had to learn how to move tens of thousands of men across roads, fields, and forests while smoke. Fear and noise destroyed every plan made on paper. The armies were brave, but bravery without training became confusion. Confusion became panic. For Lincoln, the lesson was severe. He needed a real army, not 90-day volunteers. He needed generals who could organize, supply, and command on a scale the United States had never attempted before. The war would require factories working day and night, railroads moving men and weapons, hospitals, camps, taxes, and a new level of federal power. For the Confederacy, Bull Run brought confidence, perhaps too much confidence. Many Southerners believed the victory proved Northern soldiers had no stomach for war. That belief would lead them to underestimate the North's capacity to recover, reorganize, and return with far greater force. Chapter 4. Lee and Grant. As the war expanded, two commanders came to symbolize the struggle. In the East, the Confederacy found Robert E. Lee. He was a respected soldier, a Virginian, and a man of deep religious faith. Before the war, Lincoln's government had considered him for command of the Union Army. But Lee could not raise his sword against Virginia. When his state seceded, he resigned from the U.S. Army and joined the Confederacy. Lee became commander of the Army of Northern Virginia and quickly proved himself brilliant and daring. He took risks that shocked his opponents. He divided his forces in the face of larger armies, moved fast, and attacked with confidence. His men worshipped him. To them, he was more than a general. He was the embodiment of their cause. In the West, the Union's most important commander emerged from obscurity. Ulysses S. Grant had failed at many things before the war. He had left the Army years earlier and struggled in civilian life. When the war began, he returned to service with little glamour and no aristocratic image. Grant was quiet, plain, and often unimpressive at first glance. But he possessed something many Union commanders lacked: relentless will. He did not panic easily. He did not retreat after hard fighting. He understood that the Union had greater resources, and that victory required constant pressure. At Fort Donelson, when Confederates asked for surrender terms, Grant demanded unconditional surrender. At Shiloh, after a devastating first day of battle, some expected him to withdraw. Instead, he attacked the next day and won. Grant accepted terrible losses, but he kept moving. The contrast between Lee and Grant would shape the war. Lee relied on speed, boldness, and the devotion of his soldiers. Grant relied on pressure, coordination, and the grinding weight of Union power. But before the two men faced each other directly, the war reached one of its darkest days along Antietam Creek. Between these two men stood a long list of commanders who struggled beneath the weight of modern war. George McClellan built a magnificent Union army, but hesitated to use it decisively. Other Union generals attacked badly, retreated too quickly, or failed to understand Lee's speed. On the Confederate side, boldness often produced victory, but it also cost irreplaceable men. The Civil War was becoming a new kind of conflict. Rifled muskets could kill at longer ranges than older weapons. Railroads could move armies faster than before. Telegraph lines allowed governments to communicate with commanders across great distances. Photography carried images of battlefield death to civilians who had never seen wars so clearly. The old romance of battle was being stripped away, replaced by mud, disease, amputations, and mass graves. Chapter 5. Antietam and Emancipation in September 1862. Robert E. Lee carried the war onto northern soil. He marched into Maryland, hoping a victory there might change everything. If the Confederacy could win a major battle in the North, perhaps Britain or France would recognize Confederate independence. Perhaps Northern voters would lose faith in the war. Perhaps Lincoln would be forced to negotiate. The Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by George McClellan, moved to stop him. On September 17, 1862, the two armies collided near Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek. It became the bloodiest single day in American military history. At dawn, fighting erupted in a cornfield. Union and Confederate soldiers advanced and fired through tall stalks that were soon cut down by bullets and artillery. Men fought at close range in smoke so thick they could barely see. The field changed hands again and again until it was covered with dead and wounded. The battle moved to a sunken road where Confederate soldiers held a strong defensive position. Union troops attacked repeatedly and were cut down. Bodies piled in the road. Blood ran through the dirt. The place became known as Bloody Lane. Later, Union forces attacked across a stone bridge that would carry the name of General Ambrose Burnside. By the end of the day, the armies were shattered. Nearly 23,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. Tactically, Antietam was not a clean victory, but Lee retreated back into Virginia, and that gave Lincoln what he needed: a moment strong enough to change the purpose of the war. Until then, Lincoln had described the conflict mainly as a war to preserve the Union. He worried that moving too quickly against slavery might push the loyal border states into the Confederacy. But as the war grew more terrible, Lincoln came to believe that the Union could not be restored as it had been. Slavery was not only a moral evil, it was the labor system that sustained the Confederate war effort. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation declared enslaved people in areas still in rebellion to be free. It did not immediately free every enslaved person, because it applied only to territory the Union did not yet control. But it changed the meaning of the war. The Union Army became an army of liberation wherever it advanced. The destruction of slavery became a central war aim. The proclamation also allowed black men to serve in the United States military. Free black men and formerly enslaved men joined the Union Army. They fought knowing that capture could mean execution or re-enslavement. Regiments such as the 54th Massachusetts proved their courage under fire. The war for Union had become a war for freedom. After Antietam, photographers reached the battlefield and captured images of the dead where they lay. For Northern civilians, these photographs were shocking. War was no longer only described in newspaper reports or patriotic speeches. It could be seen in the faces and bodies of men left in fields, roads, and ditches. Lincoln visited the Army of the Potomac after the battle. He was frustrated with General McClellan, who had failed to destroy Lee's army when he had the chance. Lincoln needed victory. But he also needed commanders who understood that the Confederacy would not be defeated by caution. The war demanded action, but freedom would demand still more blood. Chapter 6. Gettysburg in the summer of 1863. Robert E. Lee tried once more to invade the North. His army moved through the Shenandoah Valley into Pennsylvania. Lee hoped to threaten northern cities, gather supplies, and perhaps win a victory that would break northern morale. The Union Army of the Potomac, now commanded by General George Meade, moved to intercept him. The armies met by accident near a small crossroads town called Gettysburg. On July 1, the fighting began west and north of town. Union forces were pushed back, but they managed to hold high ground south of Gettysburg, forming a defensive line shaped like a fishhook along Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Ridge. On July 2, Lee attacked the Union flanks. The fighting became savage in places that would become famous: the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top. At Little Round Top, the Union left flank was in danger. If Confederates captured the hill, they could threaten the entire Union line. There, the 20th Maine, commanded by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, held the far end of the Union position. Chamberlain's orders were simple: hold the ground at all costs. For hours, his men fought off repeated attacks. Their ammunition ran low. The line bent back under pressure. At last, Chamberlain made a desperate decision. He ordered his men to fix bayonets and charge downhill. The sudden attack shocked the Confederates and saved the Union flank. On July 3, Lee made his greatest gamble, believing the Union center might be weak. He ordered a massive frontal assault across open ground towards Cemetery Ridge. The attack would be remembered as Pickett's Charge. Before the infantry moved, Confederate artillery opened a huge bombardment. The ground shook under cannon fire. Smoke covered the fields, but much of the fire overshot the Union line. Then thousands of Confederate soldiers stepped out of the woods and began marching across nearly a mile of open ground. Union artillery tore gaps in their ranks. The men closed the gaps and kept moving. As they came closer, Union cannons fired canister shot. Then Union infantry rose behind stone walls and poured musket fire into them. A few Confederates reached the wall. For a brief moment, the line trembled. Then the attack collapsed. The field was covered with dead and wounded. Lee's army had failed. Gettysburg cost more than 50,000 casualties in 3 days. It was the high water mark of the Confederacy. Lee's army escaped back to Virginia, but it would never again invade the North on that scale. Several months later, Lincoln came to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the dead. His speech was brief, but it gave meaning to the sacrifice. He said the nation was engaged in a great test of whether a republic based on liberty and equality could endure. Gettysburg did not end the war, but it changed its direction. Gettysburg also became a place of memory almost immediately. The scale of death overwhelmed the small town. Bodies lay in fields, orchards, woods, and roads. The smell of decay filled the summer air. Local people and soldiers worked to bury the dead, while families across the country waited for letters that would never come. When Lincoln spoke there in November 1863, he did not speak long. in only a few minutes. He connected the sacrifice of the dead to the survival of democratic government itself. The war, he said, was testing whether government of the people, by the people, and for the people could endure. The Gettysburg Address became one of the clearest expressions of what the war had become. The dead had not only fallen for territory or military advantage. They had fallen in a struggle over whether a free republic could survive and be reborn. Chapter 7. Vicksburg. At almost the same time Lee was retreating from Gettysburg, another decisive Union victory came in the West. The city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, sat high above the Mississippi River. It was one of the last major Confederate strongholds blocking Union control of the river. As long as Vicksburg held, the Confederacy could maintain a connection between its eastern states and the Trans-Mississippi West. Ulysses S. Grant set out to take it. After failed attempts and difficult maneuvers through swamps and rough ground, Grant launched a brilliant campaign. He crossed the Mississippi River south of Vicksburg, moved inland, defeated Confederate forces in several battles, and surrounded the city. Then came the siege. For 47 days, Union artillery bombarded Vicksburg. Soldiers and civilians lived under constant shell fire. Families dug caves into the hillsides to survive. Food disappeared. People ate mule meat and whatever else they could find. Disease spread. The Confederate garrison weakened. On July 4, 1863, the Confederate commander surrendered Vicksburg to Grant. The Mississippi River was now in Union hands. The Confederacy was cut in two. Lincoln celebrated the victory by saying that the Father of Waters again went unvexed to the sea. Gettysburg in the east and Vicksburg in the west marked a turning point. The Confederacy had suffered two massive blows at nearly the same moment. But wars do not end simply because one side's fate becomes clear. The dying continued for nearly 2 more years, and the war grew harsher. Chapter 8. Total Warren, 1864. Lincoln brought Grant east and placed him in command of all Union armies. Grant's strategy was simple and relentless. Union armies would attack across multiple fronts at the same time. The Confederacy would no longer be allowed to shift troops from one theater to another. Lee's army would be pressured continuously. Grant joined the Army of the Potomac in Virginia and began a brutal campaign against Lee. The wilderness was a nightmare of smoke, fire, and confusion. The forest itself caught fire, burning wounded men who could not crawl away. At Spotsylvania, soldiers fought for hours in rain and mud at close range. At Cold Harbor, Union troops were slaughtered in a failed assault. The losses were horrifying. Many in the North called Grant a butcher. But Grant did what earlier Union commanders had not done. After each bloody fight, he kept moving south. He did not retreat to Washington. He forced Lee backward until the Confederate Army was trapped in siege lines around Petersburg, the key to Richmond. While Grant pinned Lee in Virginia, William Tecumseh Sherman moved through Georgia. Sherman understood that the Confederacy depended not only on armies, but on railroads, supplies, farms, industry, and civilian will. In September 1864, he captured Atlanta, a major rail and industrial center. Its fall helped Lincoln win re-election, proving that the North would continue the war until victory. Then Sherman began his march to the sea. He cut his supply lines and moved across Georgia, with 60,000 soldiers. His army destroyed railroads, burned military supplies, seized food, and crippled the economic base of the Confederacy. His goal was to show the South that the Confederate government could no longer protect its own people or resources. Sherman's men tore up railroad tracks, heated them, and twisted them around trees. They destroyed barns, warehouses, and plantations. They did not seek to kill civilians, but they deliberately destroyed the material system that supported the Confederate war. As the Union Army moved, thousands of enslaved people left plantations and followed. To them, the arrival of Union troops meant that freedom was no longer an idea printed on paper. It was walking down the road in blue uniforms. In December, 1864. Sherman captured Savannah and offered it to Lincoln as a Christmas gift. The Confederacy was collapsing. Its money was nearly worthless. Its railroads were broken. Its soldiers were hungry. Families wrote letters begging men to come home. Desertion increased. The presidential election of 1864 hung over everything. If Lincoln lost, the new administration might seek peace with the Confederacy. For much of the year, the war looked grim. Casualty lists were endless. Grant's campaign in Virginia seemed to many like slaughter without progress. Northern morale weakened. Then Atlanta fell. Sherman's capture of the city changed the political mood. It proved that Union armies were still advancing and that victory was possible. Lincoln won re-election. And with that victory, the Confederacy lost one of its last hopes: that the North would choose negotiation over continued war. The final act approached. Chapter 9. Appomattox. By early 1865, Lee's army was trapped around Petersburg and Richmond. Grant's pressure was relentless. In April, Union forces finally broke the Confederate lines. Richmond, the Confederate capital, was evacuated and set on fire by retreating forces. Union troops entered the burning city. Among them were United States colored troops, black soldiers marching through the capital of the Confederacy. For enslaved people who watched them enter, it was a moment of impossible transformation. Lee fled west with the remains of his army, hoping to find supplies and perhaps join other Confederate forces. But Grant pursued him. Union cavalry blocked the roads. Infantry closed from behind. The Army of Northern Virginia was starving, exhausted, and surrounded. Near Appomattox Courthouse, Lee saw that there was no escape. On April Noah, 1865, Robert A. Lee met Ulysses S. Grant in the parlor of a home owned by Wilmer McLean. Lee arrived in a clean gray uniform with a ceremonial sword. Grant arrived in a mud-spattered uniform, without a sword, his appearance plain and tired. The contrast was striking. The polished aristocrat of the Old South and the relentless soldier of the industrial North. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers would lay down their weapons and sign paroles promising not to take up arms again. They would not be imprisoned. Officers could keep sidearms. Men who owned horses could take them home for spring planting. Grant also ordered food sent to Lee's starving army. There was no celebration in the room. The mood was solemn. Grant understood that victory had to become reunion, or the war's bitterness would poison the future. When Union soldiers began cheering and firing salutes, Grant stopped them. "The rebels," he said, "were our countrymen again." The formal surrender took place days later. As Confederate soldiers stacked their muskets, Union General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain ordered his men to salute them. Confederate General John B. Gordon returned the salute. For a moment, after 4 years of slaughter, dignity passed between defeated and victorious soldiers. The Army of Northern Virginia ceased to exist. The Confederacy was dying. The Union had survived. Lee's surrender did not immediately end every Confederate force in the field, but it broke the central military reality of the Confederacy. Other armies would surrender in the weeks that followed. The rebellion had lost its greatest army and its most revered commander. For soldiers on both sides, Appomattox was not simple joy. It was exhaustion. Men who had spent years killing each other now stood close enough to see one another as human beings again. Many Confederates wept as they stacked their weapons. Many Union soldiers watched in silence, understanding that victory had been purchased at a price no parade could fully redeem. Chapter 10. Lincoln's death. The North erupted in celebration after Appomattox. In Washington, crowds filled the streets. Bells rang. Flags flew. The great nightmare seemed to be ending. Abraham Lincoln had lived long enough to see the Union saved, but only barely. The war had aged him terribly. His face carried the weight of hundreds of thousands of dead. He was already thinking about Reconstruction, about how to bring the South back, how to protect formerly enslaved people, and how to heal a nation that had nearly destroyed itself. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater with his wife, Mary. The play was a comedy. For a brief time, the president could sit in darkness and listen to laughter. At about 10:15, John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and Confederate sympathizer, entered the presidential box. He waited for a loud moment in the play, raised a small pistol, and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln collapsed. Booth leaped from the box to the stage, injured his leg, and escaped into the night. The wounded president was carried across the street to a boarding house. Doctors could do nothing. Cabinet members and officials gathered in the small room and waited through the night as Lincoln's breathing slowly faded. At 7:22 the next morning, April 6, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton looked upon him and said that he now belonged to the ages. The joy of victory turned instantly into grief. A funeral train carried Lincoln's body back to Illinois. Along the route, Americans stood in silence, watching the murdered president pass. The man who had preserved the Union would not guide its healing. The war had ended, but the struggle for the meaning of freedom had only begun. Epilogue. The cost of freedom. The American Civil War remains the defining trauma in United States history. About 750,000 soldiers died. Many more were wounded, disabled, or psychologically broken. Towns and families across North and South lost sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands. The South's economy and infrastructure were shattered. Railroads were twisted, cities burned, farms ruined, and entire communities left in poverty. But the war also destroyed slavery. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment sought to protect voting rights regardless of race. These amendments rewrote the Constitution in the aftermath of war. Yet, freedom was not simple. Reconstruction would become a difficult and violent struggle. Formerly enslaved people built families, churches, schools, and political communities. But they faced terror, discrimination, and new systems of oppression. The promises of the war would be fought over for generations. The end of the war also raised questions no battlefield surrender could answer. What would freedom mean for people who had been enslaved all their lives? Would formerly enslaved families receive land, education, protection, and political rights? Would former Confederates regain power? Could a nation built partly on slavery remake itself into a nation of equal citizenship? These questions would define Reconstruction. They would also reveal how difficult it is to win peace after winning war. The Union had defeated the Confederacy, but racism, political violence, and the struggle over citizenship would continue long after the armies went home. Still, the Civil War changed the nation forever. Before the war, many people spoke of the United States as a collection of states. After the war, the Union became something more permanent and indivisible. The question of secession had been answered on the battlefield. The question of slavery had been answered in blood and law. The country that emerged from the war was scarred, grieving, and unfinished. But it was also transformed. The war proved that a republic could survive its deepest internal crisis. It proved that freedom could not be separated forever from the meaning of the Union. And it showed that the price of preserving a nation, when that nation is divided by injustice, can be almost beyond imagination. The American Civil War was not only a war between North and South. It was a war over what America had been, what it would become, and whether the words liberty and equality could survive the terrible test of fire.